We are joined now by a long-time NHL player agent. Joins us every Wednesday in the business of sports. Ritch Winter joins us. Ritch, how you doing, my man?
I'm good. I'm still wrapping my head around our initial discussion about the love and dynasties segment when you were concerned we wouldn't have enough to say over the course of an hour, and you missed 2 commercial breaks.
Yeah.
So it was fun. How was Hawaii?
You know what? Hawaii it was unbelievable, man. I'd never been to the Big Island before.
Oh, really? Yeah.
I loved it. It was a great mixture of relaxation for the first few days, and then we did a few adventures and went zip lining and snorkeling and helicopter riding and just drove around to different areas. The Pokaloo Valley, which so the Pokaloo Valley is on the Big Island. It's like a dead end road where you kind of drive around, then you come into it, and you have to walk. You walk down this alley. So this valley, and wait, up until 1946, people actually still lived in the valley. And there's no like electricity down there running water. Like it was, and then there was a tsunami, and no one ever returned down in the valley. So they actually have wild cows in the valley. There's a few cows that are wild, and they're pretty rank, I guess. I was talking to the guy on our helicopter tour, but just to get down in there, it's unbelievable. There's black sand, and it's so peaceful and tranquil, and you get, and they're really big on history in Hawaii, of course, as you know, and so they keep a lot of these trails in great condition with all the original, like this is the donkey trail and how they use, they would climb up and have the donkeys have to load everything up, and it's pretty steep. But it wasn't that bad at all to get through. But I could see when it's wet or something, it would definitely be a tougher climb. So it was awesome.
It's funny because when Max McCormick, the captain of the Coachella Firebirds, a client of mine, called me from his vacation in Hawaii when we were negotiating his deal, and he just got back from hunting deer. And I'm like, in Hawaii? Like, are you sure? And so he sent a picture and bagged a big 6-pointer, pretty nice rack, and I didn't know what kind of deer it was, but never thought you could do half of those things in Hawaii.
Well, they have you can hunt boars there.
Really?
Like because in a certain part, it's funny. In certain part of the island, no problem. In other parts, and more of the lush parts, like they have a little problems with the wild. Well, they call them pigs, but they're really wild boars.
Yeah.
And so anybody, if you're a local resident, you can hunt them year round.
Yeah, or move to San Antonio and just try and hunt them in your front yard and hopefully get them all. Yeah.
So it was awesome. I want to get, and so we have Steve Hauschka joining us today. Of course, very successful NFL career, 13 years in the NFL. He had the NFL record for consecutive made 50-yard field goals in the postseason. He was 24 out of 25 on field goals. Went to a Super Bowl. Now though, he's a culture consultant and a performance coach, which is very interesting. So we'll talk to him about that. Talk to him about some of the coaches he had over his time. But before we get to that, I do want to ask you, the Mikko Rantanen trade just happened here in the last 2 weeks, and I haven't been on since. And there was a few things about it. Like, it's very rare that we see like a top 10 player in the game get traded midseason. It doesn't happen very often.
Very often.
And his comment though afterwards, when he was like, well, because he's a pending UFA for anybody who doesn't know. And, him in Colorado obviously couldn't come to an agreement with his agent. And he said, well, I would have taken less to stay there. And I'm kind of like, well, what does less mean? That can mean anything. Like,
right. $10. Yeah.
I want 14 mil, but I'll take 13.7, like technically it's less. But just his thoughts about it. It seemed to me that when a player comes out and says that, and you've had different players, you've had superstar players, you have fourth line guys, but the bigger contracts probably take a little bit longer at times to get to. Is there any chance that a player he's 5.5 months away from being an unrestricted free agent, wouldn't be up on any negotiations that were ongoing between his agent and the team?
It seems amazing to me that would be the case. Now, sometimes in bigger agencies, they got a lot going on and they don't have the time. They just don't have the time to attend to these things in detail. But I was astonished to read that he was taken by surprise. I'm thinking you would have had that conversation like, Mikko, buddy, like, we're pushing hard. I don't get it. They clearly are not moving.
Yeah.
Like, you have to understand there's some risk here. Now, if that conversation's had, I don't think he's caught by surprise,
Right.
So I was a little surprised that comment, but it's Yeah, it's just different. I mean, I don't think, again, I think it's the difference between the big and small agencies. I'm not just going to pick on them because we're a smaller agency, but, there's guys out there like Kurt Overhart, who's got a medium-sized agency. He's very, very big on attention to details. There's a lot of guys who are very good at it, but I keep hearing time and time again. I remember when I got Brizgeloff as a client, like I went to a meeting at Coffee in Phoenix after promising my wife that I'd, really focus on just spending time alone with her. I said, honey, he's going to get $60 million. I mean, it's Coffee, probably nothing's happened, but I do have to go. And he hired me at Coffee because his big agency at the time hadn't talked to him for 3 months. And sometimes it's like the guy who asks the pretty girl to the dance and everybody's shocked that he was able to bring her. And the only reason was nobody had ever asked her.
Right.
Because they just assumed she wasn't going with any of us. So right. I think sometimes it's, sometimes the people you think would be getting service.
Yeah.
Aren't getting service. I was shocked to talk to a first-round pick today of one of the teams in the NHL who's played a couple of years and hadn't heard from his agent for 6 months. But that's what people sign up for in what I call the puppy mill. If they have 150 NHL clients and 4 agents and they're recruiting 200 players, you know what? You get more phone calls when they're still recruiting because you're in the honeymoon period. But I'll tell you, when you need an agent, and Mikko appears to have needed one to inform him, then quite often they just don't have the time to there. I remember one of the big agencies, one of the clients was firing him to hire us. So he called them, and you can't even believe this, but it's he asked him, he told him he was letting them go, and the guy said on the phone, well, you're really important to us, but I'm in the middle of something now. Can we talk tomorrow? They didn't even have time for him. And that's not part of the sales pitch. Like families don't understand that. I mean, and what happens is you sign up with the big agency because Connor Bedard's there. Well, your kid's not Connor Bedard. So you don't have the leverage to get the service.
Right.
Then what happens when things aren't panning out like you expected, they just let you go. They just don't phone you back. They don't work on it. So it doesn't surprise me. He's with a big agency. Doesn't surprise me that looks like they missed the mark. I don't want to be too critical because I don't know all the facts, but it's a huge issue in our sport,
How does it work if a player wants to change an agent? Like if let's say Rich Winter's my agent and it's February now and I'm like,
so you definitely want to change. Okay, I get it.
I'm like, you know what, Rich, it's been a slice, but I'm going to move on. Is it cut and dry that day? How does it work?
Very simple. You just have to, usually I ask the guys to call their agent, man up. And, you've been with them for 3 or 4 or 5 years, like him or not like him, you've had a relationship. So call them and tell them. And then, but technically, or from a legal perspective, all you have to do is send them a fax and confirm that the relationship is terminated. Now But
how does it work for because the contract, you get paid on a percentage basis of the contract, right? So do you get that percentage based on up until that point? So if you're, 70% through the season, you'll get your percentage of 70% of his salary?
No, there's an arbitration years ago between Ron Salser, a good friend of mine, and Alexei Zamnov. And the arbitrator decided that the new agent would get 10% of the fee. And the old agent who did all the work and had built the relationship and spent time on, he gets 90%. So my dream scenario is to sign 15 guys to 8 times 8 the year before I retire and have them all fire me. Because basically,
then you'll get 90% over the term, or the 90% over the remainder of the contract.
Yeah. So, because it doesn't make any sense. Can you imagine? Like, you work your tail off.
Yeah.
You've been with this kid for 6-7 years because these idiots are, they're recruiting them at 12 now. So you've been there for 6, 8, maybe 10 years. Now at 22, he's a superstar. Come out of his entry level contract, and he signs with the new cap. He's probably signing 8 times 10. Well, it would make no sense for the player to sign for 8 years at a huge amount of money and then say to the agent, thank you very much. I don't need, I don't want to pay you. So very, it's really not complicated. Players are sometimes, they're all challenged to make the phone call because they're generally pretty shy guys. They're team oriented guys. It feels to them like they're firing one of their teammates. It's uncomfortable. But it's happening more and more now because guys are realizing there's a big gap between service and no service. And because agents are now starting to look at providing more because you're getting a 3% shot of $8 million. So you got to provide more than go for dinner, do my deal,
right,
and stay in touch. Because quite frankly, you could do the deals. They're not that complicated. It's the work that goes into positioning them and getting the right spot. And then ultimately, gosh, they'd rather be at dinner with the girl over in the corner than you, but they humor you and spend time with you. And so what value are we providing? Right. And so I think there's a lot more value being provided by a lot more of the agencies. I think sometimes the bigger agencies are just falling behind because they don't have the time. They have the resources, but they don't have the time to put that kind of work into their business and develop it. I mean, we're still working on a model, many of them that in the agency world, same model that existed when Alan Eagleson was there.
Right.
Make a few calls, do the deal, hope that's enough. Well, that might have been enough when they're making $85,000, $100,000 a year. I can't believe when I was representing Peter Bondra years ago, after he got his first 30-goal season, he switched to us, and his goal was to get up from 125 to maybe 200. It's a different world. But in that world, there wasn't that much more money. I remember we'd organize, we had a deal with Norwegian Cruise Line, so we'd organize trips for our players. They would come, fans would come to associate with the guys, get autographs, play a little floor hockey on the cruise ship. And you get everybody coming. Now, they all own their own cruise ship, so nobody's coming. So, but it's just a different world. And I mean, when they're making that kind of money, they're associating with people that are very successful. They're getting the best of the best because they can buy it. And at some point, they're turning at their agent and saying, 3% of $9 million, that's a lot. What am I getting for it? And that's an angle that we play when we're talking to players. Like, what are you getting? Of course, we think our service offering is the best in the business. I'm sure Kurt thinks his is, and I'm sure other guys think theirs are. Most of them aren't, but we're getting those questions more and more. Like 3%, maybe. What am I getting? So it's interesting.
Yeah, well, 3% of $1 million is a lot different than 3% of $100,000, right?
Exactly.
It's just your total amount, what you're paying out. So it has changed. With the announcement today, you saw the NHL, and it wasn't just a proposal. Like, basically, it's signed the salary cap numbers over the next 3 years, significant increases. And so how does that, like, in your projections? So let's say you're representing a player now, and so his contract comes up, and so you're looking at comparables. But a lot of those comparables were signed when the salary cap increases hadn't been put into place. How do you factor that into negotiation?
You just try really hard to convince somebody that makes sense. But
there's not a real formula per se based on
not
percentage?
really. Well, we'll argue that, of course. Look,
Right.
I mean, next year we're up 14% from when that guy signed his deal. So let's do that. The other thing you'll argue on a longer term deal, I know you want it flattened out, but year 5 of this deal at $2 million, who knows? That could make him the lowest paid player on the team. So working through that. But I think one thing that a lot of people haven't thought through, I don't think, I'm sure many agents have, but there's a lot of money tied into the big players. The top players, they went after the deal when the cap was flat for reasons I don't understand. And now they're tied into these deals. So what's probably going to happen, the competition, there'll be obviously a Rantanen type will bring up a lot of competition. Maybe he'll go back to Colorado for less than his agent was asking for. But at the end of the day, there's going to be a lot of money for that middle 6 forward, that second pairing defenseman, because most of them haven't signed long-term deals. So I think what we're going to see is what we saw 15 years ago, where we had guys on the third line making $2.5, $3 million, 10 years ago.
Right.
We're going to return to, I think, the $3 million player on the third line and maybe the $2 million player on the fourth line, because you need all those guys to win, and you have cap room. Right. I mean, I think if you look at that's what Oilers did this year. They went really hard at trying to fill up that bottom, the bottom part of the lineup. I think Brad Treliving did a pretty good job doing the same thing in Toronto because he had no money. So he's forced to do it on no money. But now those guys are going to be, what'll happen? One of those guys will get 3, and then everybody else will get it. Right. So because there'll be money in the system that's not being used in the superstars. The last 5 years has been, we can't give it to you.
Right.
We got to give you the minimum. We can do that. Maybe we can go 25 more than that, but we can't do any more because we just signed, Connor, and we just, extended Leon, and everybody buys into that, but they won't have to in the next 3 to 4 years.
Yeah. So I think we might see, like, I was thinking from an agent perspective, the balance of signing long-term to a bridge deal, right? Like, I know it's guaranteed money long-term. Right. And some of them work out, and people always focus on this is a bargain deal, Nate McKinnon. Sure. But there's lots of other guys that are long-term contracts that, the player ends up doing pretty well. Right. And, the team isn't. So it probably comes down to each individual player, right? When who has this say, like, I'm going to bet on myself. I'm not going to worry about injuries, because in the percentage of guys who have career ending injuries, it's pretty low.
Really small. Yeah.
It's very small. So you don't really worry about that. And you just look and say, hey, if they don't want to give me long-term right now, I'll gladly take a 2-year deal and then move forward, right? How do you approach that from an agency when it comes to, negotiating the bridge deal over the long? Because if you get a pretty good, because nowadays some bridge deals are, guys are signing for 2 years at $6-7 million bucks. Like, it's not like it's a bridge deal at $1.5 million.
Right. Well, I think the issue depends on his family background, financial savings, because ultimately when you're a young man who maybe just had 2 young kids, he's starting to think a little bit more longer term now. Certainly his wife is, and pestering him about that. Now, someone puts a deal on the table, if maybe a couple $1 million less than he might get on July 1st, but it's 8 years or 7 years. And he comes home and his wife says, but honey, like if we take this deal, we don't ever have to worry about anything again. And sometimes that plays really heavily, especially if you got a young man from a family haven't had many resources. So, and every personality is different, but the risk of the long-term deal in my mind is not so much, from the player's perspective, maybe he outperforms it, but what happens if the team, if Marian Hossa was coming to Chicago after their 3rd Stanley Cup and signed 12 years, how miserable would he be now? Like we made that decision. Edmonton made a fairly serious play for him. We said no to a substantial sum of money to take about $80 million less because Marian's smart enough to think it through. He had made enough money, made $5-6 million bucks a year for 5 or 6 years. So he didn't really need any money. So he made the hockey decision. I'll go to Detroit for a year, play with Nick and Pavel Datsyuk and these guys. I'll learn how to be a champion. I've never been on a team like that. Then I'll make my jump. Well, sometimes there's a lot of pressure at home when, quite frankly, the wife is looking at this and she's looking at the 3 babies. She's now pregnant. It's like, think about this, so it really depends. And I think, there's risks. The risk for the player, the biggest risk is you thought this team was going to be pretty good. And for some reason, the Rantanen didn't sign. And then somehow it fell apart. Nobody wants to come there now. And next thing you know, somebody else asks out. And now you're maybe in a place that isn't as attractive as you thought it was. And, it's, and you don't want guys overpaid. I think it's funny. I never want guys overpaid. I don't want them underpaid. There's a range for every athlete and NHL player that, at the upper end of the range, it's a little bit too much. But no one's really thinking about trading him. The reporters aren't all over him because of the big deal. At the other end of that range, he's making a little less, but he's not firing me. You want to be at the upper end of the range, but you want to be in that range because people think being overpaid is a blessing, but it's not.
No.
Because you're miserable. No. You don't feel like you're delivering. Your kids might be getting a little rousing at school. It's actually easy to be underpaid because everyone's like, oh, what a great value. This is amazing, right? But when you're overpaid, life can get pretty tough, especially when you start getting overpaid because you're not performing in the first 2 years of a long-term deal.
Yeah.
Now you have to live with their thinking. Like, think about James Neal, made the wrong decision. How bad was his life after that deal? He went for an extra year, as I understand it, in Vegas, and they blew him off. And then he ended up in an absolute mess. I'm sure he would have enjoyed those 4 or 5 years now if he would think about it in retrospect. So the dynamics are more personal and athletic than financial, because when you're talking about $5 or $6 million deals, these guys all have enough money to make it through the rest of their lives.
Yeah, it's true. Rich Winter joins us. When we return, we're going to focus on, acknowledging and releasing fears in sports and how that relates to success and confidence and trust, and culture consultant, performance coach, and also former NFLer who's been in the Super Bowl. So we'll tie in some Super Bowl and all of this stuff next with
Super Bowl winner.
Stephen Hauschka joins us next on the Jason Gregor Show on Sports 1440, Oilers Nation, YouTube, Facebook, and X, along with Rich Winter. Welcome back, Jason Gregor, Connor Halley, Rich Winter with you on Sports 1440. We are here on the business of sports, and a very special guest joining us. Our big guest of the day, brought to you by Silent Rides Charter Company, one of Alberta's premier bus charter companies with state-of-the-art motor coaches that will safely take you or your team to your next destination. Book your ride today at silentrides.ca. And our next guest is a Super Bowl winner. Spent 13 seasons in the NFL, won a Super Bowl with the Seattle Seahawks, also kicked for the Ravens, the Broncos, and the Buffalo Bills. He has quite the career path. He graduated cum laude with a degree in neuroscience from Middlebury College. He might be the smartest kicker the NFL's ever had. And of course, now he's a culture consultant and a performance coach. Steve Hauschka joins us. Steve, welcome to the show, man. How you doing?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Jason. Hey, Ritch.
I got to get to my initial question. When I was reading your bio and I'm like, neuroscience, like, because you never even played football till you're 19. So it was not even really, something you thought of growing up. You were more of a soccer player. But tell me, when you're a neuroscientist and then you become an NFL player, how does neuroscience help you as a kicker in any form?
That's a good question. I think I had an awareness of kind of how the brain works. I don't know, maybe that helped me a little bit mentally deal with some of the fears and the I think I had an understanding that it was totally normal and natural to feel nerves out there. And that was a big part of my journey was playing soccer and lacrosse was very much a team sport. You're in the flow of the game. When I switched to football as a sophomore in college, I basically failed. I didn't make the varsity team at Middlebury as a freshman for the soccer team, and so when I was kind of twiddling my thumbs, figuring out what I was going to do, and all my roommates were football players. And I said, you know what, I'm going to try this football thing. And I won the job, and the first few times I stepped out there in this game, it was like felt totally different than those other sports had felt. There's all this pressure, everybody's eyes were on me.
Yeah.
And the feeling of like making and missing it was like so elevated, or like if I missed, it was like the worst feeling. And so I realized, like, okay, I'm going to have to get the mental side of this thing figured out. Otherwise, I'm not going anywhere with this.
Yeah. Well, it's great that you talk about your position, because the kicker position is one where, you get called upon and it's either you make your field goal. And when you make field goals, people are like, yeah, okay, he made it. And, and you miss it. And then it's like, oh my God, this is the worst, right? Like the mental focus, because some games, I'm sure, Steve, you were on the sidelines up until the final minute of the game. You haven't even been in the game, and now it comes in, the game's on the line, and like, okay, Steve, you're coming in to kick a 48-yarder. And I don't even like, what do you do during the game to stay in the game when you're not in the game?
It's a great question. And you're right on the money there for realizing that part, because you can't wait until the third quarter to feel confident. You might only get one kick in the game, and your first kick might be the most important kick of the game. It might be your first kick might be in the fourth quarter to tie the game. That's how these football games work. So you have to cultivate the confidence before you get out there. And I had this whole like routine. I did this thing called tapping, and you basically do all these affirmations and build up your confidence before you get out there. But it really enabled me to go from a state of like a little bit scared of getting out there to like, let's go. Let's like, I got this thing. I want to be out there, and I'm going to like, I believe in myself and I can go for this. So that was my journey was, before games, leading up to them, I'd be like, a lot of people watching, there's a lot of people watching. This is an important one, it's windy out there. But then I would just take all that stuff and I would convert that energy into like, I can do this, man. Like, I know what I'm doing. I love what I'm doing. I'm a great kicker. I'm going to go for it. And I'd use that self-talk to get me into this state of like ultimate conviction and belief.
Like Steve, you and I have talked about this before. It's just like what were you seeing in terms of observing of your teammates? Because I'm assuming, and we'll touch on what you're doing now shortly, but how did that prepare you for what you're doing? How did you see, what role did you play with a Pete Carroll like team where Pete's very very communicative? Like, what role were you playing for a coach like Pete in Seattle, kind of being able to be an observer of what was going on around you? Did that play any role in how the coaching staff relied on you?
Yeah, in Coach Carroll's culture, so early in my career, I kind of bounced around and I spent some time in some organizations where it was very old school leadership. And when I got to Seattle, it was the complete opposite. I'd never seen anything like that in all my years of sports. It was this super infectious, like positive energy, optimism, um, extreme focus on like what were the most important things to do today, and like having fun, like competition, all this stuff. And like guys had no clue how hard they were working because they're having so much fun and everything had a positive spin to it. It was not a grind. Like there was zero grind. And we became one of the best teams in the NFL for a couple, really 3 years there. I think we were the best team. We only came away with one Super Bowl. But it was the way we were doing it too that was so special. And as a kicker, you couldn't ask for a better situation to kick in, because that's the exact way you need to think as a kicker, to go out there and do that. You have to believe it's going to go well before you get out there.
Well, Steve, like, Pete knew so much about all of his players, and I'm assuming you included. Did he come to rely on you at all in a different way because of the fact you were in a position where you could observe what was going on? I was curious if he was aware of that and came to you at any kinds of times to say, what are you seeing, Steve? Like, because
so I was a young guy when I got there, and later he opened up. When I was a captain, towards the end of my time there, he opened up to all of us captains and kind of explained his methodology, where a lot of it came from. He realized that he had to coach the older players a little bit differently than the younger players.
Okay.
And he asked us to basically help him guide these younger guys. And but he had a really well-established system. Like, he didn't need my help there at all. He didn't need any of the players' help. He just needed us to kind of, stay within the system. When I got to Buffalo, with the first-time head coach there, and Sean McDermott, he definitely needed some feedback from, the leaders on the team, the captains, and so that's where I was able to help a little bit more there.
Stephen Hauschka joins us, a Super Bowl winner with the Seattle Seahawks, 13 years as a kicker in the NFL. And I know that, I want to kind of get into what you're doing now, because it's very unique. You're a culture consultant. You're also a performance coach who helps athletes and teams enhance their potential. But, culture's, it's a word that's used a lot, Steve. And I think sometimes people say their culture, but they don't really know how to instill a culture. I guess, what would you define as a culture? And do most teams, and even individuals maybe that you've encountered do they think that they have a culture, but it's actually opposite or different than what they think they have?
Great question. So culture is really like how people talk to each other, how people act, how people behave. It's the relationships they have, and it's really the energy that lives with building these different sports teams and businesses, for that matter, too. It's, if you think about a professional athlete and the way that their mind needs to think, or any high performer, the habits, the behaviors, the skill set that they have to have mentally. Culture is really the collective mind of an organization. It's the accumulation of all the different minds of the people that work within the organization, and how that all comes together. And when a team comes up against a challenge, how is that team gonna view that challenge? Are they gonna view it as a threat, or are they gonna view that as an opportunity to go be their best selves? And little things like that make a huge difference to performance. You can imagine a football team with 70 guys on the team, a bunch of them young guys. They're about to play a good team. You can imagine if they view that as a threat and they're scared of it. It can make them play tight. can make them try really hard, too hard almost. Trying hard at the highest levels of sport can actually affect impact performance negatively. So how you frame these opportunities, what you focus on a daily basis, what are the pillars and the things that people can come back to and relate to with each other. So culture is something that really needs to be built. It needs to be a reflection of the leader in the organization.
Okay.
And then there needs to be almost like, if the leader is the Wi-Fi router, there needs to be repeaters in the building, people that are,
Okay.
throughout all different parts of the building who are repeating that, and they are, in line with everything. And you can be guaranteed, if you're not putting energy into culture, that it's probably a mixed bag. And there's a lot of people that are not performing to their absolute best, because they're gonna fall behind. They're gonna fall into those thought patterns that aren't as productive, that may be negative, that they might view things as threats. They might be afraid of really expressing themselves or being an individual, or like truly going for it, which in sports and in business is everything.
Steve, I'm always talking about, like in the National Hockey League, I think there's a lot of really good guys who are coaching, but they have no skills. I know you work with our mutual friend Mike Gervais, and talk to Mike all the time about really what his first step, and I'm sure to some degree it's yours as well, is you're trying to hydrate the coaching staff with the skills you have so they can be repeaters, like you say, but they can also be teachers. Can you explain the process and the things you find when you go into work with a coach that are oftentimes missing, and how do you handle that?
You'd be amazed how many people in high level positions um, have the X's and O's part down, but then they get hired because of that. But it's a whole different skill set to be a leader. As a leader of an organization or a team, you've got to be able to manage people, and really the job becomes, how do I elevate everybody to their best potential, and how do I give them a message that's like, I remember one time, one of our team meeting rooms, there's 70 guys, they're all alpha males, huge guys, and then you have this new head coach walk up, and they're just judging them, looking them up and down. Be like, why should I listen to this guy?
All right.
Give me a reason why I should listen to this guy. So there's a skepticism. So it takes time, it takes trust, it takes consistent messaging to be like, okay, I can like sell out for this guy. Because guys are always going to be conserving, like, hey, is he going to push us too hard where I don't know if I can give it my all, and maybe I should conserve a little bit. There's a trust that needs to be built. And then if the messages don't make sense, or if there's holes in them, it's just going to all unravel, and guys are going to be like, I'm not going to listen to him. So you have to have really like well thought out messages that, and a lot of these things can come from within the team. Actually, the most organic messages come from the players. They're just amplified, and that magic is kind of bottled up. Like, how many championship teams have you seen talk about, some special moment that happened that season, and that became the rallying cry for the team and the city, for that matter?
Steve Hauschka joins us. Steve, we'll take a quick break. I want to come back, and I want to dive into the neuroscience background that you have, and with the culture, and really the importance of it. You said positive messaging, and I think, saying it but then acting on it are two very different things. And we'll get into that next on The Business of Sport on Sports 1440, Oilers Nation, YouTube, Facebook, and X. 444, we continue on inside the Jason Gregor Show. It's our weekly Business of Sports with longtime NHL agent Ritch. We always like to touch on different aspects of the business of sport. There's so many of them. And today, very special guest sticking with us, of course, a Super Bowl winner, 13-year NFL career, has a degree in neuroscience from Middlebury College, is currently a culture consultant and performance coach who helps athletes, teams, and organizations enhance their potential. Steve Hauschka is with us again. And so, Steve, I wanted like your neuroscience degree, and I think in sports, a lot has changed and evolved into understanding the mental side of the game. And your position, probably one of the most mentally demanding positions, because, you know, you might be on the field for a total of 9 seconds that have two of the most crucial plays in the entire game. You talked earlier there about building culture and then getting messaging and repeating that messaging. So when you talk to a team to kind of start it, because I think everybody listening, whether they coach U9 or a football team or whatever, they want to build a good environment, but maybe they don't know how to navigate it. And what are some tips that you'd recommend on if you want to instill a culture, like what are the must-have, for sure bases of a foundation that you need? I can't hear him.
Can you hear me?
Oh, now we can, yeah.
Okay. There's a lot of ways to skin the cat. You know, you saw Bill Belichick do it one way. You saw Pete Carroll do it another way. Andy Reid's doing it his way. There's a lot of different ways to win. In the NFL, you can have an incredible, you can have an outlier at head coach or GM or quarterback, put together an organization that's phenomenal. It's so difficult in the NFL with salary cap and all that, the free agency and the draft. It's really hard to put it together. So in the NFL, like culture is everything, because it's one of the real places that you can get the most out of everybody. It depends. It's got to be authentic to the leader, and it really has. You can't build a culture that's not in alignment with the way the leader thinks, acts, and behaves, if that makes sense. So
his values, basically.
His values, and what he believes leads to success. So if you tried to take Coach Carroll's optimism, competition, those pillars of like having fun, and gave that to Bill Belichick, I think it would be a disaster.
Okay,
so, if you really want to break it down, though, it's the best way to think about it is if you're a coach. So you're asking kind of for high school, college,
sure, yeah,
level,
yeah.
Okay, if you're a coach, you need to think about it this way: what are the things that I can say that'll help every person on my team get better at what they're doing, and show up better in games? So, during the practice week, that's a little bit different than in the game, the day before the game. But during the practice week, you're really trying to get them to focus on having an amazing practice. And what does that look like? Well, you got to talk about, hey, this attention to detail. Hey, we need this to look good. We need A, B, and C. This is what it looks like to be really great at that. And you got to coach it. I mean, there's no way around the X's and O's. So putting their focus on that, and there's practices, everything. I mean, one of the, I think every culture practice should be instilled as like where you build the program.
Okay.
And so I've seen teams where they go 80% in practice because, hey, it's practice. The best teams are going 110% in practice, and then in games they're relaxing. They're treating it like it's practice. It's like, hey, we're playing the game. This is fun. We already put in the work. We can just go trust it. So that's like a guaranteed recipe. That one, I don't see a way around that unless you have freak athletes that can turn it on somehow. But practice builds a lot of habits. So you got to be going full speed. You got to treat it like it's a game in practice.
Stephen, I think for me, it's always interesting how great players have a really difficult time making the transition to be a coach. And listening to Steve Kerr on one of Mike Gervais' podcasts talk about, now here's a guy who played for Phil Jackson and Greg Popovich, yet his first trip upon getting the job in Golden State was to go see Pete and Mike. And I found it interesting that the first bit of homework that Pete gave to Steve was to go figure out what his values are, because he said, like you said earlier, I mean, the players will find you out. If you're acting inconsistent with your values, you'll be seen as a fraud fairly quickly. But when you see these, I just thought it was interesting that Steve was so aware of the fact, despite the fact he played for some of the best coaches that ever coached in the NBA, he hadn't seen it from a perspective of a coach. And I was quite surprised that he was a little bit shocked that Pete asked him for his values to start with. Do you see good players having that same struggle, and how do you address that?
Good players having that struggle of transitioning to coaching?
It's a coaching, yeah.
Well, I think there's a whole nother thing of leaving behind the ego of being a player, which is a whole challenge. And is Tiger Woods going to be the best golf instructor? I think he naturally knew how to swing a club at a young age in a way that you could never teach somebody. I sometimes struggle with that as a kicking coach. Like, there's just natural elements, I think, that every athlete has that are hard to quantify and really break down and explain to people. It's just like pro athletes have a gift of how they move their bodies and use their minds out there. But then the real step then to becoming a great coach is breaking all that down, processing all that, and using that to help people in the next stage. And that's the hard part. So the reason the reason Coach Carroll inspired Coach Kerr to do that work, that was very much a big part of Coach Carroll's process. Right. He was fired from the Patriots after, I forget what his record was, but it was pretty decent. And he had a year or two break between that and being hired as the USC head coach. And he went deep on his philosophies, and he didn't really, I guess he didn't really fully explain that to ownership at the Patriots. That was what I read, but he went full in on his philosophy when he got to USC. And that's how he built the culture. And it was special. I mean, it was all about competition. I played in that same culture in Seattle. It's all about competition, all about having fun. You had celebrities coming out to practice. You had, in Seattle, we had Dr. Angela Duckworth, who's like the lead
I just read her book. I just read her book on grit. It's unreal.
Yeah, she came and talked to us, and like that was the environment where it's like, hey, we're going to bring in the world's leading expert on grit, and she's going to talk to you guys. And like, what an inspiring place. We had endless stimulation. It was all about growth mindset. And it was intoxicating. Like, we were having so much fun. We didn't know that we were working as hard as we were. Like, we had Drake come out to a practice, watch us.
Kick a field goal?
Huh?
Kick a field goal?
He didn't kick a field goal, no, but he broke down our practice. And, we would regularly have, soccer team, like U.S. men's national team came in practice. We had Tottenham Hotspur out there. So he was like, the more the merrier. And he would put these people up on stage and have them talk to us.
And he never worried about things like if you're riding motorcycles in off season or going skydiving. I don't know if that was allowed, but he was just believe things are meant to be. And tell us some of the things that you found surprising in practice. I know his film sessions, the coaches spent a lot of time making those maybe as much fun as a movie you might see on Friday night. Or tell us about the basketball hoop that I believe was quite often in his facility.
Well, Coach Carroll, he likes to have fun himself. He goes and jet skis, and I once saw him out on Lake Washington. I was on a paddleboard and he was on his jet ski, and I was waving over to him. He thought I was just a fan. He didn't recognize me, but yeah. So at practice, we had lots of funny things. Like, he inspired his coaches to get creative and find ways to grab guys' attention and as they coached. So we had this awesome coach, Rocky Seto, who would come up in front of the team meeting room once a week. It was a team favorite. We loved it, and about a 5-minute video. But you'd always have he would connect nature documentaries, like nature, to he'd make some connection to how we need to show up as a team. So he'd show ants crawling and Brit making a big bridge together and stuff, and then he'd show the O linemen locking arms. And I don't know, there was I forget the exact details, but there was some really funny analogies there, and guys were hooked, and that would just create fun engagement for the team. Obviously, a lot of energy for him to create it, but those are the types of things.
But the basketball wasn't the basketball.
So the basketball hoop
for competing all the time, and you even brought it on the road, I think, in playoff games.
Yep. The basketball hoop was at the front of the team meeting room, and we would start out each team meeting with a free throw shooting competition, and he'd bring up 2 guys each time, 3 guys, and you'd shoot. You'd get 30 seconds to shoot, and it was usually an offensive guy and a defensive guy, and so there was pressure there, and you're competing and trying to make a bunch of shots, but yeah, that was the energy. So everyone was juiced up. Guys were hooting and hollering. So that's how we would start our meetings. And then we carried that through the day before the Super Bowl. That's what we're doing in Arizona and in New York.
Who is the best shooter on the team?
Brian Walters was really good. He's he was he played basketball in high school. He was really good.
Yeah. Stephen, when learning through it, you talked about kind of, when you were young and then you go to different organizations, and I loved your explanation how when a new coach walks in the room and there's so many players and there's all, big egos and alpha males and why should I listen to this guy? Now I would think if you had a group who wants to win, you're like, well, I'm going to give them a chance. Or do they always have to prove it? And over time, could you sense on teams you were on, having been on a winning team, when you were on a team that wasn't a winning team, even though it had talent, that it missed that culture? Could you become one of those, you use a modem and then you need receptors around the room. Can you become one of those players in a quicker fashion, having been in a winning culture? And is that why you think so many teams in sports, like in the NHL, the trade deadline, NFL, oh, this guy won a championship, we're going to bring him in because he could be one of those vocal transmitters. He might not be as good of a player anymore on the field, but what he can bring to the culture can be more valuable. Did you sense that over your career? And could you even see it? And did you become one of those guys yourself?
Yeah, I think performance always matters, but if it's apples to apples, they know that these teams know they need this. They know they need guys who are responsible. They're professionals. They do all the right things. They know that that's important. So I definitely see that the issue with, or I don't want to say the issue, but the reality is these guys are all coming from different cultures. So you could have a great professional player, but he played for Bill Belichick for 10 years. So is he going to fit in Coach Carroll's culture?
Right.
The analogy I use is it's a lot like gardening, where the culture is the soil, and the leadership is like the gardener, and the plants are like all the different players. So if you have a culture, which is the soil, if you have culture that's super fertile, there's tons of resources for all the players. It doesn't really matter what plants you plant there. They're probably all going to do pretty well. If you have super dry soil that's got no nutrients in there, not much is going to grow there.
Yeah.
And going back to the fertile soil with a fertile culture, you can bring in players that haven't done well in other cultures and plant them in your fertile soil, and they'll do great. So like all these resources matter a ton for a player, like, nutrition, just like the culture needs to be around everything that leads to performance in each individual. So, there's nutrition, there's all the mental stuff, there's physical resources, there's tools that elevate guys' games. I mean, as a kicker, like I was only as good as what I did, the stuff that I did to take care of my body.
Right. Yeah, makes sense. One last one. I got to get your thoughts. Your former coach, Pete Carroll, back in the NFL at 73. And I know he's a highly energetic guy. Some people, oh, geez, you get old and you're going to get tired. I don't know if that's going to be the case. But when you have a coach, any team that wins together, there's always that unique bond that I'm sure is there with your teammates and as a coach. And I know you're a big fan of Pete's. What's your thoughts on how he'll do, in his new gig?
Man, I'm very optimistic. I think he's going to do great. I think it was a great hire. I think he's the best there is at building a culture. He's the best I've seen at it. And I think he's going to stabilize that franchise, which is exactly what they need. It'll be really interesting too with Tom Brady there running that. Seems like he's calling a lot of shots on the ownership side, and sounds like they're going to be installing the TB12 method for their, nutrition and conditioning and all that stuff. So it'll be interesting to see how that scales. But yeah, I think it's going to be a really interesting organization to watch.
Well, you mentioned the Belichick one. Well, that's kind of where Brady came from. So, those two worlds collide and,
they're colliding.
Yeah, you can do things differently and maybe it comes out and it's even better. It should be fascinating. One last one for you, Stephen. And what you're doing now, what do you get? What's the biggest joy? Obviously, when you play football, that's a huge joy. But right now, as a culture consultant, what's the biggest joy you get out of your job now? Because you talked earlier about it, you make it fun and you're going to want to, you come to work, you work harder. In your job today, what are you doing that's fun that allows you to work hard?
I just know how important it is to winning. It's fun to be connected to winning.
Okay.
Through this part, I'm not kicking footballs anymore, but I know that this is every bit as important as being on the field, and it's influencing winning at the same amount or maybe even a greater amount from higher up. So I really am having fun with that part of it.
Well, Steve, thanks so much for joining us, man. We'll have to have you back on again another time. We really appreciate it. Who you picking in the Super Bowl?
Oh man, I just don't even want to watch it, but I'm going to. I'm going to. I don't know. I guess Eagles.
Eagles.
Yeah.
Hey, well, two good teams, man. And the Chiefs are obviously going for history. No one's ever won 3 in a row, which is pretty remarkable. So it should be a heck of a game. Two very different ways.
And thanks to the pause, you're going to have guacamole. Thanks to President Trump. So you guys all be okay in your living rooms.
Thanks, Steve. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks a lot, Steve.
Thank you guys so much. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Rich.
Take care.
That's Steve Hauschka, Super Bowl winner, and fantastic. Just the importance of culture, and I want to dig into it because it gets used a lot, and I think a lot of our audience hears it, but doesn't really know, what. Or we want to build a good culture. Well, of course you do, right? Like, hey, we want to score more goals. Like, yeah, thanks, Captain Obvious.
But it's like your coach saying, I want to create an Italian dinner for you when you come over, but he's never taken any cooking classes. Like, what's he going to do? And that's the problem. We have a lot of good people in hockey, but they've never been, the first thing Mike and Steve do is teach the repeaters, which starts with the coaches. Yes. Teach them the skills that they don't have. And you get a guy that went 50-2 in the East Coast League because he had a good team. He little bit okay with X and O's, gets the same experience by luck in the American Hockey. Then he put him in the NHL and he's got a struggling team. He has no idea how to communicate with them. Right. You hear the kind of things that Pete's doing, from the basketball hoop. Steve actually, the one value that Steve put in place in Golden State, a little bit different than Pete's, was joy. You go to a practice at Golden State and Steph Curry knows when there's people observing and coming with Coach Kerr just to kind of watch. He'll come by with the basketball and laughing, and they'll say, "Look at me, coach. I'm having so much joy, man. This is so awesome." And when your best player buys in it too, it's healthy. But if you look at that culture pervades everywhere, but it's real. It's authentic. Yes. Like they have every picture in their practice facility is there's players smiling or laughing. But Steve lives like that. So it's authentic and it can carry it through. I really believe it's true. Players are happy and relaxed. They will perform at their highest. They won't hold their stick. They won't be scared to go out for that next shift.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. Ritch, great stuff, man. Who are you picking in the Super Bowl?
I don't follow football. I only have got the guacamole out for this weekend. I really could care less, but I just have an affinity, I suppose, to being of the same spiritual persuasion of the head coach of the Chiefs that I kind of lean away to get Andy to win, and I think he's such a good man and got good values, and he's brought a lot. I like to see him win, but on the other hand, you know what? Philadelphia is a tough spot. They don't win very often, so I'll be happy either way. But hopefully get a 48-47 exciting finish.
Oh, that'd be unreal.
I don't care otherwise. Yeah.